The following compilation features unsettling and spine-chilling tales sourced from Reddit's horror communities. Reader discretion is strongly advised. These narratives may contain graphic descriptions, psychological distress, and themes that could unsettle sensitive individuals. Proceed with caution, as immersion into these eerie stories may provoke fear, unease, and sleep disturbances. Enter this realm of Reddit's creepy horror stories at your own risk, as the line between reality and the macabre may blur within these chilling narratives. Maybe this is all because I called my ex-girlfriend a bitch on her wedding day. Today is July 6th, 2 months after my best friend's wedding. I'm not one to believe in fate, but as a kid, I was sure I had found my soulmates. I remember discovering the word soulmate as a curious 10-year-old digging around on my older brother's laptop. Jace's girlfriend had broken up with him, and his Google search history was a plethora of, "Have I just lost my soulmate?" That person entangled with you is upset, and rightfully so, but that does not mean you can't make it right. You are in charge of your own destiny and can win them back. Follow the red ribbon of fate. Spoiler alert, that weird post was kind of right. They're happily married with kids now. Anyway, this isn't about my brother's soulmate. This is about my friends. Like I said, they were my soulmates. When Dexter McIntyre ran up to me in the 4th grade with a red thread tangled around his thumb, I should have known better. Your mom gave me this. I should have cut it off him. Rather than teasingly slipping my finger into the knot, Zach Chatham and Phelan Clark joined in, entangling our thumbs. It was supposed to be fun until we realized we had tied the knot a little too tight. Phelan was the crybaby in class, a tiny girl with a golden ponytail and a loud mouth. She made sure to be extra vocal to our teacher. Freckled redhead, Zach thought it was funny, giggling through the whole ordeal. I'm not sure what he found so amusing about being painfully bound by a single piece of string that was quickly cutting off our blood circulation. We had to be gently escorted from the classroom, still uncomfortably pressed together. Phelan was crying, and Zach's laughter was getting a little throatier. He kept yanking his finger, which only jolted all 4 of us. "Ow!" Phelan squeaked. She shoved him. Hard. Zach was no longer smiling, his freckles a lot more prominent under the fluorescent white light in the nurse's office. "Are we going to die?" he whispered. When Nurse Cale pulled out a scary pair of scissors, he almost fainted. Dexter was unusually quiet. The boy kept sending me worried glances while the nurse hacked her way through our binding. From the look on her face, even she was baffled at how tangled up we were. It didn't make sense how one single piece of thread was so strong. "How did you even manage to do this?" she hissed, grabbing sharper scissors. "He did it," Zach grumbled, trying to point at Dexter, from his uncomfortable position pressed into my shoulder, though he just manically flailed his free hand. "I didn't tell you to join in," Dexter snapped back. "You're a stupid head for sticking your finger in the knot." "I am not," Zach spat. "You started it." "Mr. McIntyre, don't be rude." The nurse sighed. "Apologize to your friend." "Bird isn't my friend." I could tell the nurse was growing impatient. "Zach, please don't use that nickname." "Dexter, say sorry." "Sorry," Dexter muttered under his breath. "I can't hear him," Zach said matter-of-factly. I said, "Sorry, I still can't hear him." Dex shoved him. "Well, maybe you're deaf." Zach shoved him back, the 2 of them stumbling. "You're the deaf one." "Thank you." The nurse sighed. She cut us loose with one single snip. She left to get juice boxes, and for a moment, the 4 of us were in stunned silence. It was Zach who started laughing first. Then Phelan joined in, giggling. His laughter was contagious. Dexter was smirking, and I was trying really hard to stubbornly stay quiet. Instead of laughing, I picked up the red thread that had been severed from our fingers, dangling it in Dexter's face. The boy snatched it off me, still trying to hide his grin. I'll get rid of it. But I definitely saw him slip it into his jeans pocket. I only knew Dexter from his nickname. The other kids called him Bird because his shabby dark hair resembled a bird's nest. I was vaguely aware of his family situation. His mother left him, running off with a college boy, and his father was an alcoholic. Dexter came to school wearing dirty clothes and smelling of stale urine, his hair growing out into a greasy, knotted mess. The other parents would always tut and whisper when he passed them, not so subtly pulling their children close to them like he was diseased. Mom told me not to go near him or I'd catch lice. In the winter, Dexter would arrive with no coat in minus temperatures. His shoes had gnawing holes through the soles, and I could see his bright red toes poking through. Still, Dexter never lost his smile. He wasn't an outcast among the class, even if parents highly disapproved of us associating with him. Dexter McIntyre lived in his own bubble where he could make jokes and hope kids wouldn't turn on him. So far, it was working. After the red thread incident, we got to know him a lot better. Suddenly, Bird was actually Dexter McIntyre, whose biggest fear was becoming his father. He liked chocolate milkshakes and Zelda, and hated being alone. I remember first stepping inside his place, exchanging confused glances with Phelan and Zach. The hallway was real white marble. When I was greeted to a chandelier, a suited man insisted on taking my coat. I burst out laughing. The house was huge. It had 4 bathrooms. Dexter's house was bigger than mine. I marveled at the architecture, a mix of modern and ancient. There were 2 kitchens, one upstairs and one on the ground floor. Obviously, there was a noticeable mess, even with a maid, who greeted Dexter with a kiss on the forehead. She ruffled his hair, complaining of its length, ignoring the beer cans littered everywhere, dirty plates and pizza boxes piled up in the kitchen. I ran up to the refrigerator and yanked it open, pulling out 4 cans of soda. Dex was trying to hide small white baggies on the countertop. It's candy, he said hurriedly, dumping them in the trash. My friend's house was not what I was expecting. The boy's parents were rich. Like, rich. It was just his dad who was failing with basic parenting. Dex had a bedroom, and 2 spare ones he used for video games and watching TV. His bedroom was full of clothes and new shoes, which confused me. I picked up a pair of $90 trainers with the tags still attached. Dexter had a whole closet full of clothes, but he had holes in his shoes and wore the same shirt and jeans. I watched him pick up a brand new shirt, flinging it across the room. I'm not allowed to wear anything my mom bought me. Zach opened his mouth to speak, and Phelan nudged him. Instead of asking questions we really wanted answering. The 4 of us played Zelda until Dexter's father came home, called us a bad word, and immediately crashed on the couch. When I told Mom I had been inside Dexter McIntyre's house, she didn't get mad. In fact, my mother was only vocal about Dexter's lack of hygiene in front of the other moms. When I was eating breakfast, she slipped a note in my hand, stroking my ponytail. "Can you make sure to give this to Dexter McIntyre today, darling?" I nodded, but I had plans to trash the note. I knew what it was going to say. "Stay away from my daughter." I did peek at it, though. I was curious. "Dexter, darling, would you like to come for dinner on Saturday night? I was wondering if you would like me to give you a haircut." Mistress Lee. Underneath, in smaller writing, she had scrawled the children's crisis number. Crumpling up the note, my cheeks were burning. I had seriously misunderstood my mother. I gave it to Dexter, and after skimming through it, he started crying. Zach comforted him with his DS, Phelan squeezing us all into a hug sandwich. Dex did eventually come for a haircut, not on that Saturday, though. Instead, Dexter came for burgers and s'mores. The following weekend, Dexter McIntyre sat in my kitchen with a towel wrapped around him while my mother washed his hair and then cut it into an easily manageable style. Zach told Mom about the clothing situation, so she went out and bought him new clothes. I think Dexter had been brainwashed by his father that his mother was the devil incarnate. He wore the new clothes with no problem. as long as Dex's mother had not paid for them. His father didn't say anything. I wanted him far away from that house, so I invited him to hang out every day. Rain or shine or snow, I made sure Dexter was by my side. What I didn't expect was to develop a crush on a certain member. I hid my feelings, though. Dexter and Phelan shared a moment at the summer fair. Zach and I didn't even find out until a month later, when it was clear the two of them were growing closer. I caught them awkwardly holding hands, and they both went tomato red. Dex nudged the girl out of the way. "Ugh! We're not a thing," he grumbled. "Phelan is too stupid. I have standards." Ever since getting a haircut, finding his own style and being labeled as cute by the other girls in class, Dexter thought he was the next River Phoenix. Phelan's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded, sniffling. "Yeah, Dex is disgusting." I shot Zach a grin, who in turn stuck his tongue out and threw the candy he'd been eating in my face. Turning 12 years old, Phelan and Dex no longer tried to hide their little thing. When we were hanging out at the park, he'd rest his head on her shoulder, grasping for her hand. Zach rolled his eyes at me, pulling a face, and I suddenly got really sad for no reason. They were cute. It wasn't quite dating because we were too young. The two of them were a slowly blossoming thing that wasn't quite a thing yet. Neither of them knew how affection worked. They broke up over a tuna sandwich before rekindling a day later at school. But I saw the way he looked at her. His smile was warm and pretty, and she was glowing. Dex was Phelan's soulmate, but my gut ached. Was I sick? Did I have a fever? Why were my cheeks so red? I started to hate myself, angry at myself for having feelings. I wasn't expecting to get butterflies for Phelan Clark and her stupid blonde ponytail. Our friendship was short-lived, however. It was small and barely lasted a few years, but somehow it was special enough for us to want to cling on to it. Dad announced we were moving to New York just after my 13th birthday. I was officially a teenage dirtbag, and this was my present. Initially, I stayed quiet for a while. Mom said we had 2 weeks before the move, and I should say my goodbyes, though the hot topic in class was us becoming high schoolers. It felt wrong to ruin their excitement. Zach had grown way taller and was hanging out with a new group of friends. Phelan and Dex were officially dating, but Phelan and I were also hanging out privately. It was one stupid kiss at a slumber party. Phelan said it was a joke, but she also said she kind of maybe liked it. It was a mess. A big fucking middle school love triangle. Mess. Still though, the four of us rode our bikes to the lake during weekends, and it was awkward. Not the same. I felt it in the air, as well as inside my gut. We weren't kids anymore. Now that we were older, we didn't want to play or search for buried treasure. Phelan preferred to tan under the sun's glare, and Dexter brought a book to read. Zach was comedic relief, thankfully, making jokes and telling creepypastas. I couldn't hide my smoldering cheeks, and Dexter was all but a clueless boyfriend with puppy dog eyes. So, I guess moving away was a blessing in disguise. I did eventually tell them over ice cream, my voice wobbling. We hugged and cried, and maybe got a little tipsy on Zach's father's pricey wine. They were my first real friends, regardless of how tangled we were, and I was already being pulled away from them. Phelan, I was being pulled away from the girl I could not stop thinking about. The day before I left for New York, Dex strode directly into my house and kidnapped me from my bed at 6 a.m. It was a school day. When I tried to say that, Dex covered my mouth. Mom handed us a packed picnic basket and ruffled his hair. She only said one thing: bring her back by curfew. We spent the whole day at the lake, one perfect summer getaway. Even better, we were missing school. When the sun danced across the horizon, the sky growing darker, Dex jumped up from his place sitting on a rock. His smile in the flickering orange from our campfire took my breath away. Something uneasy writhed in my gut when I stared at my friends through the flames. Zach, who was less smiley than usual, head tipped back, his gaze on the stars twinkling above us. Phelan, Her hair was caught in a whirlwind whipping across her face, and she looked so sad. Despite her laughter and forced smiles, every time I glanced at her, she averted her gaze. "We should make a pact," Dex said, pulling something from his pocket. The red thread. He held it over the fire, and something twisted in his expression to make sure we stay friends forever. I noticed his eyes darken significantly, flicking to Phelan, no matter what. Zach burst out laughing, Phelan jumping up and wrapping her arms around him. "You kept it," I managed to get out through a breath. Dex nodded. He ducked and grabbed a book he'd brought. "Okay, so the book says we do this at midnight." He shot me a grin, wrapping the red thread around his index finger. "Do you think your mom will kill us?" I shrugged. "Probably, but it's only 2 hours." We spent those 2 hours talking about everything and nothing. The boys dipped their toes in bioluminescent plankton and swapped stories from when we were kids. I sat on a rock and tried to keep my emotions in check. I loved Phelan and Dex, and getting in between them was something I didn't want to do. But I also had really bad butterflies for my best friend. Eventually, I pulled her away from the fire where she was making s'mores, and I said goodbye to her. The two of us sat in freezing cold water up to our ankles, and Phelan said she'd wait for me. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. I didn't know what the context of wait was. Would she wait for me as a best friend, or something else? I asked her what she meant, and Phelan opened her mouth before Dex interrupted. The boy waved the book. "It's almost midnight." He raised a brow at our joint hands. "Are you guys gonna kiss?" I pretended not to see him trying to hide a smile. At the stroke of midnight, the four of us stood under a perfect full moon. Dex said we had to repeat exactly what we did at 10 years old, entangling our thumbs. Dex read a passage from the book, and I can remember every word. I can remember an uncomfortable tightness in my chest, like we were being physically bound together by every word. When the pain became overwhelming, I tried to tug away, but the others stayed still, unmoving and unblinking. The moon cast an eerie glow in their eyes, like she was filling them, polluting them. A bond as close as ours can never be broken, and if so, we will pay the price and be brought together again and again. Then it was over. Dex severed the thread from our fingers and dropped it into the fire. Zach looked uncomfortable, wrapping his arms around himself. "Do you guys feel weird?" he asked in a small voice. I didn't say anything, but I did feel weird. Before I could speak up, though, my mother found us. She dragged me away before I could say a real goodbye. 13 years later, Phelan forgot to invite me to her wedding. After college, Phelan Clark and I reconnected on Instagram. I actually found her by accident while looking for the perfect flowers for my mom's funeral. Several accounts had suggested her now deleted account, Flora Flowers. As soon as we started talking, old feelings came back. I invited her for drinks. Phelan looked no different. She still wore overly long dresses and daisies in her hair, but as an adult, she made it work. Her hair was shorter, blonde curls bouncing on her shoulders. When I saw her, I felt a pull drawing us together. That same sting in my chest from when I was a kid, but it was a good sting. I sensed it. That invisible ribbon tangled around the two of us. The closer we got to each other, the warmer and safer I felt. I got overly emotional about my mom's death, and Phelan hugged me, opening up about her own life. She and Dex officially broke up in their junior year when she caught him and Zach hooking up in the darkroom. Phelan explained that ever since our pact, things had been different between the three of them. "Different in a good way?" I asked, sipping my overpriced cocktail. Phelan shrugged. "Kinda." She blushed slightly. I don't know how to describe it, but it felt wrong when we were away from each other. It started with Dex and me, and then he and Zach. Phelan looked sheepish. When it became clear that something was going on between all of us, we tried to make it work. Her eyes found mine, but it was painful. It hurt being so close together. She sighed. Without you. I nodded slowly, smirking. Ah, you guys missed me. Phelan didn't smile back. She leaned across the table, almost knocking her drink over, her lips close to my ear. I mean physically painful, she whispered, her breath grazing my ear. It was agony, for all of us. It felt like being ripped apart, like my soul was poisoned. When she straightened up, her expression was different, contorted, like she resented me. I started to notice her hollowed-out eyes under the club's twinkling lights. Downing the dregs of her cocktail, Phelan's smile twisted. It got bad enough that we started to get physical symptoms. She counted them on her fingers. Zach collapsed during class and had to be revived. Dex started throwing up blood clots. And, according to my doctor, I went into cardiac arrest. Phelan's lips curved into a small smile. Would you believe me if I said what we were experiencing was heartache? I laughed nervously. This is a joke, right? Phelan's eyes were dark. I couldn't go near them. She whispered, without you, whatever we had was incomplete. Without you, it fucking hurt us. So, we found other ways to deal with it. I already knew what was coming. Something slimy twisted in my gut. He didn't. Phelan didn't meet my eyes. He did, right at the start of senior year. Phelan. We searched for you. Ruby. Her voice broke a little. The summer before our last year, we came to New York to try to find you. Phelan let out a breath. You have to understand that even being close to you at such a long distance and yet closer, it started to hurt less. Zach knew roughly where you were, so we just kept driving. And the closer we got, it was a relief, like whatever had been choking us had let go. I opened my mouth to speak, only for her to cut me off. We found your house. Phelan laughed. Who needs Google Maps when you have an invisible magnet pulling us towards you? I suddenly felt very sick. I never saw you. Phelan traced her finger around the rim of her glass. Well, yeah, she said bitterly. Your mom told us to leave. She said you had new friends, and we'd make it awkward. So, we left. We got back in Zach's car, drove in silence all the way back to town, and the boys and I never spoke to each other again. I had a hard time finding my words before she reached for my hand. And yet here you are. Phelan's lip twitched. Should we try finding Zach? I found my breath. Probably not a good idea. I'm not fully aware of the details of that night. I just know that Phelan and I became an actual thing. It did hurt at first. Without the boys. I understood what she meant, but we got used to it. It just meant we had to space out our time together. During the day was particularly painful, enough to convince me I was dying. So, we used the night instead. Then, Phelan disappeared. No note, explanation, or even a text. And then it started to hurt. For the first few days, it felt like the flu. Then I started losing my breath. Countless emergency room appointments told me I was fine. But I felt like I was suffocating. Every breath was painful. My heart ached in a way I couldn't understand. When I started heaving up blood, I tried to contact Phelan. No such luck. Flora Flowers was gone. And when I dragged myself there physically, it had been shut down. By then, every day was debilitating, and I felt like I was losing my mind. 3 years. 3 years of inhalers, agony, and contemplating suicide. I caught the announcement on Facebook of all places. I don't even go on Facebook. I was trying to find an employer from my bar job, and a mutual friend had commented on the post. Congratulations, Phelan and Sarah. Choking up blood was now a daily occurrence. Skimming through the post, I swiped at my wet lips. Sarah Kingsland, 26 years old. According to her profile, Sarah was a squeaky clean girly girl who said things like, okay. Her whole profile was Phelan. Sarah's latest post made me feel nauseous. Today, I am marrying my soulmate. Underneath, to my confusion and anger, was Zach's comment. The Zach Phelan had supposedly cut contact with and never spoken to again. Can't wait. I'm definitely going to cry. Love you, Val. I saw red. I'm not proud of what I did next, but you have to understand, I am not the asshole in this. I turned up at my ex-girlfriend's wedding wearing the best dress I could find. I was breathless, furious, and maybe a little drunk. I missed the ceremony itself. I was turned away without an invite, but just as I was leaving, I felt it, a sharp pull, a tightening in my chest that physically twisted me around. Cheering caught me off guard. Confetti was being thrown in a whirlwind. I saw Sarah first. Dressed in light pink, she was beautiful. Surrounded by friends and family who were not me, I watched Phelan Clark emerge through the door wearing a wide smile, draped in a breathtaking white dress that flowed like liquid silk. Her hair was longer, almost to her stomach, braided with flowers. She really did get that Rapunzel-style wedding. It was hard not to notice how ghostly white she was, like she was being drained. But her smile was real, not the strained grin she gave me years ago, full of pain. Phelan was happy. I watched her kiss Sarah, her new wife, scooping her up, making her squeal with laughter. When she threw her bouquet into the small crowd, I bit back that relentless pain straining my chest. I made peace with my old friend being happy and no longer part of my life. I could ignore that squeezing in my chest and move on with my life without her, as long as I distanced myself as much as possible. I started to walk away, until I saw who caught the bouquet. Dexter McIntyre, 25 years old. He was still ruggedly handsome, with a matured face and a scruffy, artsy look that screamed pretentious film student. The dark shadows under his eyes were prominent, highlighting darker, hollowed-out punctures I barely recognized. Dressed in a white shirt and casual jeans, with a pair of Ray-Bans sitting on disheveled brown curls, he was so Dex my eyes were already stinging. Bird had come a long way from his middle school nickname. Dex held up the bouquet with a laugh, waving to Phelan, who cheered. At that particular moment, I didn't want to acknowledge his loose shirt collar or the way he was slightly off balance. I was too busy scanning for another familiar face. There. Zach Chatham was further away from Dex. His style was less casual, khaki pants and a suit jacket, a Polaroid camera hanging around his neck. With his mop of dark red hair and freckles, he looked like he had stepped out of a vintage photograph, a touch of nostalgia mixed with charm. Seeing Zach, regardless of how mad I was somehow a comfort. I had missed him. My ex-best friends stood at a reasonable distance apart in the crowd, intentionally ignoring each other's presence. Before I could stop myself, I was already striding towards them. Phelan met me halfway in 3 heel clacks. "You bitch," I said before I could stop myself. The crowd around us started to murmur in surprise. "Ruby." Her voice was a low hiss. "Don't do this now." I didn't want to hurt her, but she had hurt me. Even worse, she had left me with no breath for 3 fucking years. "You invited the guys," was all I could choke out, gesturing to the boys. Zach looked awkward, and Dex had the nerve to roll his eyes. I ignored the crowd erupting into murmurs. Phelan's wife stepped forward, but my friend gently shoved her back. "But not me. Are you fucking serious right now?" I was getting more confident, more angry, until I was hysterical, spluttering on a cough. "You left me for 3 years with no explanation in this state." I gritted through my teeth. "And now you're married to someone I don't even know?" "Don't start this now." Phelan's cheeks were growing paler, and I wondered if I was the culprit. I was standing too close, an all too familiar pang in my chest. Her eyes pleaded with me, but I was past reasoning with her. I felt like I was drowning. Phelan didn't speak to me, but she did tell Dex, who was hovering over us, to take care of it. That was the nail in the already shattered coffin. I slapped her, and somehow I was the one who felt the sting. "Take care of me," I spat, "like a fucking dog." "Not the team, Ruby," Dex sang in my ear, his breath tickling my cheek. He reeked of alcohol. With him close, the pull was back, forcing us together. "Didn't you say Dex was dead?" I spluttered. Dex's eyes darkened. He folded his arms. "So, you did meet up with her?" "I told Ruby you were drinking." Phelan snapped. "Which you are." He pulled a face. "Some friend you are." Dex's hand wrapped around my arm to pull me away, and I shoved him back. We are not friends. His laugh caught me off guard. Good. He was definitely slurring his words. You put us through hell for 15 years, and you think we're friends? Dex snorted, and it came out. All of that pain and anger he'd been suppressing. Your psycho mother told us to screw off when we needed help, and you couldn't answer one measly letter. I didn't get any letters, I said through gritted teeth. For a second, Dex looked confused before he rolled his eyes. Oh, you didn't get one letter, not even a text. In the 15 years we were apart, you never got one fucking inkling we were in pain, that we fucking needed you. I felt my body jolt when he stepped closer. From the strain in his eyes, Dex had felt that pull too. He staggered away, offering me a two-fingered salute. Go home, Ruby. Phelan started towards Dex, but he shook his head. Stay away from me, his voice broke. You actually met up with her? Her expression crumpled. Dex, it was for closure. Bullshit. What? You knew where she was, and how much pain I was in, he whispered, and you kept your mouth shut. Dex stumbled. I'm done with all of you. Wait, Zach spoke up. But what about the... You can shut the fuck up. Dex turned to him. You blocked me because you're a coward. Zach looked hurt, putting on a mask as always, but he still laughed, still emitted that Zach charm. Oh, I'm the coward. I'm not the raging alcoholic who sponges off of his dead mother's bank account. Dex snorted. I'm sorry. Weren't you begging for my dead mother's bank account 5 years ago to pay some debt collectors? Oh, you couldn't fucking wait to throw that in my face. Dieter, jackass. Dieter. Zach laughed, shoving Dexter. Are you fucking 12? Oh, I'm 12. Dex shoved him back. Don't you still live with your mom? At least I have a mom. Stop, Phelan shrieked. Just leave, all of you. Her words were final, and so were mine. I nodded, swallowing. You're all dead to me. The second the words left my mouth, I felt a shift in my mind, a sudden, contorting twist in my body. It felt like my chest was being squeezed, my heart suffocating, in one single breath. I was sure I was going to collapse, all of the breath being sucked from my lungs. I could feel it, the sensation of something unraveling inside me, coming apart by the seams, severing. When my next breath was no longer a pant, a desperate cry for oxygen, I could have cried. That debilitating ache in my heart I had been fighting for most of my adult life was gone. It was the opposite of what I felt at 13 years old. That had felt like a weight suffocating me. This was like it was lifting, finally freeing me. My second breath felt human again. My third breath was almost a sob. I didn't have to suck it in and pray it was enough. I noticed a change in the others, like a switch had been pulled. Phelan's expression softened, her hand going to her heart. The strain in her eyes, the pain she was trying to hide, was gone. Dex's cheeks had color in them, the dark circles under his eyes fading. I remember catching Phelan's gaze. She was still mad, and I still hated her. But my ex-girlfriend's eyes were filled with tears, a silent thank you. Dex's lips pricked into a maybe smile, but he still wouldn't look at me. I loved Phelan, but part of me also resented her. I was pretty sure she was my soulmate, red string binding us together or not. But sometimes it was better to just let go. We were adults with our own lives. We didn't fit together anymore, and that was okay. When Zach's camera hit the ground suddenly, splintering on impact, I barely noticed. I was completely at peace with myself, caught in a whirlwind of emotions. In the corner of my eye, the guy ignored his camera. Instead of checking if it was broken, Zach picked up a glass of champagne from a server's tray and shattered it against his own head. Something slimy crept up my throat, because his smile wasn't wavering. In fact, Zach's grin only widened when he stabbed Dex straight through his chest. It took half a second for my mind to register the blood seeping down his temples and blooming through Dexter's shirt. Screams erupted around us, but to my confusion, Dex wasn't reacting like he was confused or hurt. He laughed, like a kid. Whatever affected Zach had caught him. I saw his eyes flicker, his jaw going slack, his body jolting, like it was no longer under his control, twisting around. He dropped into a half crouch and scooped up a broken shard of glass. I was paralyzed suddenly, time coming to a confusing halt. It was the light in his glazed-over eyes that terrified me. Moonlight. Ruby. Phelan was grasping my shoulders, but I shoved her away. Ruby, we need to go. I couldn't stop staring at him, entranced, as if hypnotized. I was transfixed by the cavernous emptiness in Dex's expression as he stepped forward and, with a growing grin, plunged the shard through Zach's skull. I partially snapped out of it when blood splattered light pink confetti, pooling across concrete. Zach dropped to the ground, and Dex lifted his head, his vacant eyes flicking to me. The shard of glass slipped from his hand, yet his fingers twitched as he slowly lowered himself, groping for a second shard. He stalked toward me, slow and deliberate, and I found myself moving fast, stumbling in my heels. Dex let out an animal-like chitter resembling a war cry, before a blur of white dove on top of him. Phelan. My ex-girlfriend squealed in delight, her slender fingers tightening around his neck. It had taken her, too. I staggered back, aware of the guests screaming, caught up in a stampede. I was aware that I was backing away, my gaze fixed on their struggle. Animals. Dexter McIntyre sprang to his feet like an animal, spitting out something, which I quickly realized was what was left of Zach's eye. The man was splattered all over him, rich gore painting his shirt, staining his neck. Something sour wound its way up my throat. Dex had been feeding. Phelan anticipated his every move. The two circled each other, teeth bared. Dex lunged, like he was dancing, throwing her off balance. But Phelan was faster. She caught him in a headlock, but he squirmed free, and with strength I didn't understand, roundhouse kicked her in the face. Phelan, however, was tracking every movement, with a stiletto heel to the chest. He fell back, allowing her to easily straddle him, and with the grace of my ex-best friend, Phelan Clark extracted her stiletto heel, pinned down his twitching hands, and drove it through Dexter's heart. I found myself entranced by the vivid red spraying Phelan's face. In contrast to her white wedding dress, she looked ethereal. The thick beads of red dripping down her cheeks almost resembled strings. So beautiful. A panicked server pushed past me, drinks shattering on the ground. Ruby. Someone was screaming, no, shrieking my name. But I felt something toxic coursing through me, and it was only pointing me in one direction. Sarah stood in front of me, shaking me violently. Ruby, Ruby, what's happening? Her shriek barely penetrated my mind. What's wrong with her? She meant her wife, prowling like a wild animal. Instead of answering, I moved towards Phelan, who twirled her bloodied heel between her fingers, teasingly. I dropped to my knees, pricking my finger on a shattered champagne glass. I grasped it, molding it in my palm. What was I doing? I wasn't completely sure anymore. My body no longer felt like my own. Phelan struck first, but I already had one hand wrapped around her throat. What I wasn't expecting was for her to stab me in the gut with a nail file. That caught me off guard, but I don't remember feeling anything. Phelan took advantage when I let go and finished me off, slicing open my throat. Warm red seeped down my chin, and it was so hard to speak, so hard to tell her I was sorry. Except my mind was polluted, drowned with a hatred that tried to force me back up, puppeteering my limbs into weapons. The bride dropped to her knees next to me, her eyes glowing with an ethereal white light I couldn't understand, and drew the blade across her own pale throat. I thought I was dead. It made sense for me to be dead. However, I woke up the next morning, alive, and somehow not fatally injured. Phelan's wedding could be explained, kind of. According to the town, it was a mass hysteria event caused by a gas leak. I thought that too, until the bride herself, Phelan Clark, dressed in silk pajamas, with half of a slice of toast sticking out of her mouth, turned up at my apartment with those exact same vacant eyes and stuck a carving knife through my heart. Since my first murder, every day has been a hunt, and it terrifies me. My purpose on this earth from the moment I wake up in the morning is to kill them. On Monday, Dex drowned me in my pool. Tuesday, Phelan shot me in the back of the head. Wednesday, Zach stabbed me straight through the heart. Whatever this thing is, it has turned me into a murderer. I can't stop it. It's like being in a trance, completely out of my control. In this state, I've become accustomed to squeezing the bloodied pulp of their hearts between my fists. I know the exact weight of them. Zach's heart is weaker, and this terrifies me. Dex's is cold, so cold, I struggle to hold it. Phelan's is the smallest, easier to pulverize between my fingers. Zach is convinced that if we redo the ritual and make friends, this will stop. But trying to collaborate with your murderers who can turn on you at any moment is extremely difficult. Dex enjoys it, but to a whole other level. Ever since he ripped Zach's heart from his chest, Dex has been infatuated. Initially, Dexter was the brains. We need to bind ourselves together again, he said when we met at a distance, blindfolded, because severing whatever we had was extremely fucking bad. He tried to get us to work together. However, the more times we die, the less humanity comes back with us. Dex is the living proof of that hypothesis. It started with him treating killing as a game, but there's no winner or loser, no logic behind this. We just kill each other, come back, and kill each other again. Whatever this thing is, it's evolving inside us. At first, we were like animals. Now, I don't know what we are, something between mindless and human, with enough brains to be tactical. After acting like a rabid dog for the first month, Dex makes us suffer. He is obsessed with the human heart and why ours were chosen, entangled and bound in poison. We even tried to get the police involved, but they stepped away as soon as they saw what they were up against. In their words, this has nothing to do with us. Maybe get an exorcist? 2 days ago, I woke up after Dex drowned me in my bath. I was strung up, upside down in his dad's old annex. I was supposed to meet Phelan at a safe distance, but the asshole had knocked me out. I hated how familiar I was with his workshop, clinical white walls and plastic sheeting on the ground to avoid making a mess. I could still see what was left of Zach's old body, maybe from a week ago, a mutilated torso lying on a silver table. I screamed, my heart in my throat, knowing he was going to rip it out. Dexter had already cut into me, already plunged his gloved hands into the cavern of my chest, giggling like a fucking kid. I was half conscious, aware of my own blood spilling onto the ground, tangled and knotted around his trembling fingers. I was staring at string, a single, slimy red string he was pulling out of me. It felt like he was unraveling me like a doll. My body contorted as he pulled, and I could feel everything coming apart, body, mind, and soul. His eyes were bright, polluted, leaking moonlight that crystallized down his face. It was like there was a crack inside him, splintering. When the string caught inside me, my vision went black. I woke up this morning at home, alive, but with a little less humanity. I'm too scared to go outside, too scared to open my door. I can't fucking think straight or type I don't know what to do. It's like a never-ending game of hide and seek. We broke that pact, and those little brats are making us pay. Edit. The mail came this morning. No name, no note. Just a single piece of red thread burned at the ends. Is someone else playing games with us? Edit 2. I've been looking through old boxes my dad sent over after Mom's funeral. In them are hundreds, thousands of letters addressed to me, letters that have been torn up and torched. I can only find pieces, fragments of my friends crying out for help. Dex was right. What the fuck was my mom doing? I'm freaking out right now. I feel physically sick. Please, someone help me. him father of a 24-year-old son. I know just by the title many of you are probably discounting me as some anti-vax nut job, but teaching my son basic high school level germ theory was the biggest mistake of my life. What I thought was an important lesson any father should teach his son ended up being a major cause of tension and tragedy in the lives of my family. It must have been the way I taught him, or the age I chose to teach it to him at, and I'm hoping either of those is true, because it means that this post might prevent you from making the same mistake I did. If I'm wrong, then it just means something was inherently wrong with my son from birth, and I don't know which is worse. When my wife and I had our son, I swear I could have been counted as the happiest man on earth. I was still young at 31, but had spent my entire 20s childless, so I didn't feel like I was robbed of any youth or whatever when my wife gave me the news about her pregnancy. I swear on that day that I was going to be the best father that had ever been, and would even outdo my own dad, with whom I had a very close relationship. My son, who we will call Daniel for the sake of this post, was a remarkably easy baby. I swear he hardly ever cried, to the point where the lack of sleepless nights had my wife and I questioning if something was wrong with him. Daniel, however, was simply an unusually calm and quiet newborn. Not only would he never cry, but I can hardly remember him fussing at all, or even really smiling or laughing much. He would always kind of just stare at you, with a wide-eyed, confused, almost fearful look, like he couldn't quite figure out where he was, who he was looking at, or even how to just be a baby. As he grew into a toddler, he would continue to interact with the world with this sort of reserved, cautious curiosity. I'll admit that my son's timidness bothered me. It might not be the most PC thing to say these days, but I was really worried that my son might grow up to be the soft-spoken, quiet kid, the likes of which I used to pick on in high school. In hindsight, it was ridiculous of me to be so worried about that, of all things. But I imagine every young father has an idea of who they want their son to be. We want our sons to be strong, confident, and utterly independent, even if we would give them the world. The thought of my son growing up to be anything but a Stallone-like macho man bothered me, and I was convinced that it all came down to how he spent his childhood. So as soon as he could walk, I made sure he had a lot of outdoor time and tried to encourage sports and roughhousing whenever I could. I might have been putting Daniel through some sort of baby boot camp, but I wasn't utterly delusional. While I encouraged the sort of activities that might give him bruises and so-called character building, I still cared about my son's health and was never shy with affection or care. I genuinely loved my son and wanted what was best for him, and so I decided if Daniel was going to be playing in the mud all day, he should also be taught how to keep himself from getting sick doing so. It all started with some public access kids science show that was airing at like 3 p.m. on a Thursday. Daniel wasn't watching. He was out back playing with his toy trucks and dinosaurs. He was about 5 or 6 at the time, but I was admittedly a little high and didn't feel like changing the channel. The show's host, some middle-aged guy with an eccentric bow tie and a lab coat, was showing off an experiment that could teach your children about the importance of washing their hands. The experiment was simple. The host filled a bowl of water with ground-up pepper and oregano or some other spice you could find at home. Then he would dip his finger in the bowl and show how all the little culinary debris would stick to his skin, explaining after that the spices were like germs that latch onto your skin after you touch a surface. Then he would wipe off his hand, apply a little household soap, and dip his finger in again, showing how much less of the debris remained, before explaining that the soap molecules made the germs slippery, so they couldn't stick to your skin, or something along those lines. I was immediately excited and called Daniel in from his playtime to conduct the experiment ourselves. I never washed my hands or brushed my teeth or did any of the things you were supposed to do growing up, because I felt like they weren't the big deal everyone was making them out to be. This, I thought, was the perfect way to demonstrate the idea to Daniel, and would be something he'd carry with him for the rest of his life. I couldn't have known how right I'd be. With Daniel at my side, I conducted the experiment eagerly, just as it was shown on the television. The experiment was easy enough to recreate. albeit my explanations were much less scientific and a lot more improvised. To Daniel, it didn't seem to matter. He just stared on as I filled the bowl with water and as much pepper and parsley as I could. He had that typical, quiet kid stare he always had, as I explained how germs were tiny, living things that were everywhere, even if you couldn't see them. The visual aid of the spices really seemed to paint the picture for him, because when I pulled my finger from the bowl the first time, he outright gasped at the sight of all the black particles all over my hand. Then I did it again with the soap, and explained the importance of washing your hands and how it can get rid of almost all the germs in just a few seconds of scrubbing. I waited for Daniel's reaction, and to my surprise, it was much more than his usual cautious quiet. I could tell by looking at him that something was different. It was in his eyes, which stared sharply at my finger. They seemed to be darker than they were a moment ago. It was as if the color had drained from them as Daniel came to some private, startling realization that completely changed how he viewed the world. And he kept those eyes trained on my finger like it was a snake poised to strike at any moment. Regardless, I felt like the father of the year and sent Daniel back out to play with a juice box and a pat on his head that seemed to make him tense up. As he walked back outside, slower and somehow even quieter than he had come in, I privately wondered if he might have autism and went back to the TV. Life with Daniel became much harder from that point on. My son had become an utter germaphobe, refusing to play outside, washing his hands and toys constantly, and even refusing hugs and bedtime kisses from his mother or I. Eventually, Daniel would stop eating most food, saying his former favorite meals were icky if they had the wrong coloration or texture. Soon after, he would stop letting his friends come over, and when he started to refuse to go to school, we had to get professionals involved. The doctor said it was the worst case of mysophobia she had ever seen. It was as if Daniel could see the microscopic life crawling on every surface, like the world was some alien and hostile place, and it was agony for him to exist within it. We had to pull Daniel out of school completely when we realized we couldn't keep dragging him out of the house every day and answering calls from teachers about the panic attacks he'd have in the classroom. It only got worse from there, as we had to start vacuum sealing Daniel's twice-daily laundry loads, wrapping all the furniture in plastic wrap, and wiping down every surface before and after touching it. I had given up all of my previous hopes of molding my son into the kind of man I wanted him to be, as Daniel was now more comfortable with the harsh smell of chemical cleaners than he was with fresh air. I tried everything in a failed attempt to fix my son. I tried understanding. I tried discipline. I have spanked him once or twice. Clearly, nothing was working. But in one last attempt to get him out of what I thought was a prolonged phase, I went out and bought a cat. Daniel was about 11 at the time. I thought the animal would give Daniel some much-needed attention and affection outside of his parents, and that his love for the animal would trump his fear of germs. After all, if our new cat could clean himself with his tongue and be fine, then Daniel could certainly exist in the real world without his plastic sheets and hand sanitizer. Hell, if nothing else, the inclusion of a litter box in the house should force him out of his comfort zone. Daniel was immediately opposed to the intrusion into his germ-free sanctuary and refused to spend any time whatsoever with the animal. I, however, appreciated the sense of normalcy the cat brought into our shrink-wrapped house, even if now Daniel would refuse to come out of his room, maybe more so because of it. You can imagine my fear then when the cat went missing, followed by my complete surprise when Daniel said the cat was in his room. He seemed more chipper than usual and kept talking about how much he loved the new pet and how soft his fur was. I thought my plan had worked and left well enough alone, letting Daniel keep the cat in his room for a while if it meant he was getting over his phobia. It took me about a week to realize that the cat's food bowl wasn't emptying and that I hadn't physically seen him since Daniel had taken him to his room. I wanted what was best for Daniel, but I couldn't escape the feeling in my gut that something was wrong, so I confronted him, asking to see the cat. He seemed nervous at first, but after I sternly asked him again, he let me into his room. I was immediately on edge when Daniel didn't just bring the cat to me, and stepping into his room didn't help the feeling at all. His room was just as eerily clean as the last time I had seen it. Everything neatly folded and tucked away and literally shining as the light reflected off plastic sheets. It was too clean for a boy's room, I thought, and certainly too tidy for a cat to have been living in here for the better part of a week. I knew something was wrong. I asked Daniel where the cat was, and his usual silence did little to assuage my fears. He had that look on his face that kids have, where they know they're about to be in trouble, but they aren't totally sure why. I asked him again, and it became clear to me why he'd have his doubts. At the final insistence, Daniel opened the sliding door to his closet. At the bottom of a row of neatly stacked shelves, Daniel pulled out a large, black shoebox and held it by his feet as he looked up at me, as if trying to judge by my expression if he was going to be in trouble or not. My heart started pounding. I immediately began to worry about the cat. My cat. Was Daniel confining him to sleeping in this little shoebox? Was he just pretending to have grown on the cat this whole time and was trying to keep him from wandering around, spreading germs all over Daniel's perfect plastic-wrapped house? Has he gone the whole week without eating? I was even starting to worry that the cat had died in some kind of accident or been starved by Daniel unintentionally, and he was trying to hide the evidence from me. Nothing could have prepared me for when Daniel opened the box, showing me my cat, perfectly, motionlessly preserved in a vacuum-sealed bag. I made him clean, Daniel said, a tinge of hope that I might understand in his voice. He's perfect like this. Daniel and I were never close after that. His visits to the shrink doubled in frequency, and he started to shut off from the world as I shut off from him. His germophobia and oppressive cleaning rituals only got worse until my parents agreed that it would be best if they took Daniel in when he turned 15. A father should never say this about his son, but I felt nothing but relief when he was gone. If his grandparents hadn't taken him in, I don't know if his mother and I could have stayed together. I wouldn't see much of Daniel again until the death of my parents. Mom lasted a few years after Dad went, both of them passing under Daniel's care. Daniel was 22 now, and looked gaunt and pale, like he had been a prisoner somewhere. His hair looked choppy, like he was cutting it himself, and whenever he sat down, he did it with his knees tucked into his chest. He wouldn't even leave the house for the funeral, and the police told me Daniel had been locked in the house for 3 weeks with his grandmother's body before someone found them, too afraid to leave the house or invite anyone in. Without a job, Daniel couldn't afford to keep living on his own. Feeling bad for him, I took him back under my roof, as any father would. I had hoped his fear of the invisible, everything around him, had died down a bit in the years he spent away from his enabling parents. But some part of me knew better. As soon as Daniel was back in our lives, so were his oppressive sterilization rituals. Wiping, wrapping, and wiping again everything in sight. The time Daniel had spent away had only made his habitual cleansing worse, to the point where my home was all but covered in an ineffectual snail trail of slimy hand sanitizer and antibacterial creams. I remember feeling sick to my stomach every time I heard him vacuum sealing his laundry in the other room. The smell of bleach and harsh chemical cocktails became too much to handle, despite Daniel's constant need to keep the germs out. My wife's once dismissible health problems became exasperated until she could hardly get out of bed on her own. I started to feel sick myself, whether if from the constant chemical fumes or just weakness of spirit. I lacked the strength to fight back against Daniel's invasion of our home. It was like being in the hospital with some terminal illness, too weak to fight and surrounded by that disgustingly fake smell of cleanliness that just reminds you of death. I finally had the strength to stand up to Daniel when I found him putting something in our food. He stammered on about how it would keep us all clean and pure, and I wouldn't hear it. I snapped at him, shouting that if I ever caught him doing something like that again to his mother's food or mine, I would throw him out myself. Daniel shot me a glance, and I quickly recognized it as the same timid look of realization he had given my germ-covered finger way back during our science experiment. It was as if in that moment I became part of that dirty, unsafe world he saw everywhere else. At this point, I didn't care. I had enough, and I was ready to kick Daniel out for good. He was a grown man, and it was time he learned to live on his own. I was determined that I'd no longer be the enabling, weak father who had let his delusions come this far, and that I'd force him to face the real world for his own good, and for the good of his family. Then, Vid happened. The whole nation was forced into lockdown, and our household was no different. As soon as the news broke, Daniel insisted on social distancing, quarantining within our own home, everything. At this point, I couldn't physically remove him from my home, and so I gave in. Daniel's controlling tidiness took over the home, and I became sicker and weaker and gave up on the idea of stopping him. He designated my marital bedroom as the quarantine for my wife and assigned me to the living room, where it started to feel like I was growing into the couch. The peak of the COVID-19 pandemic passed, as did an additional year or two. I started to lose track, spending my days in a sick daze as Daniel, in his face mask and starched gloves, was the intermediary between my wife and I. As I became weaker and more dependent on Daniel, I actually started to convince myself that I was grateful for him, that I'd be helpless if my son wasn't around. When I could, I'd press my ear up to the bedroom door, hear my wife's labored breathing, and it would remind me that gratitude was wasted. One day, the breathing stopped. Some part of me knew what had happened on the day it happened, but I remained in denial for as long as I could. I refused to leave the living room, or even go near that side of the house, terrified of a reminder that I couldn't hear her breathing. Daniel had stopped going into the room as well, which only further amplified my distress. Knowing that she wasn't being brought any more meals still wasn't enough to shake my paralyzed, fearful denial of her death. Until Daniel went back into the room, it still wasn't enough to break my delusion. Hell, it actually made me start to hope that I was wrong, and that my wife was still very much alive in there, somehow, being cared for by our son. When I heard the muffled sounds of electric humming, I knew something wasn't quite right, but I still didn't break from my daze. I let myself lay there, shivering from the feverish cold, hoping my wife was okay. Then, I heard the familiar sound of the vacuum. I pulled myself from my spot on the couch and pressed my ear to the bedroom door. I listened, still too afraid to cross the threshold. I heard the sound of the shower running, and the electrical throbbing hum of power tools much louder in this vicinity. I still didn't act, until finally I heard the chilling sound of the vacuum cleaner once again, remembering the family cat. My cat, still and lifeless and eerily preserved in that plastic bag. I pushed the door open and stumbled into the room. It was dark and dank, smelling much more like the sick than the rest of the house. It was clear from the rank odor that hung heavy in the air that my wife had not left this room in the years since we started quarantine, and the thought alone made me almost as sick as the smell. Somehow, it all felt like my fault. I had somehow made her sick. I had locked her in this awful home and barricaded her from getting the help she needed. Somehow, I had even poisoned the air, and in that moment I was convinced that I had killed her. I heard the sound of the power tools again, coming from the attached master bathroom, even in the dark. It wasn't hard to make out the heavy, dark trail of something visceral leading from the bed into the bathroom. I covered my face with my shirt and stumbled, bracing my weight on the nightstand as I moved towards the bathroom door. It was cracked open, letting in a single beam of light that revealed the trail leading up to be the darkest, sickest shade of red. I paused just before the door, listening again as the sound of a power tool, clearly to me now a saw, running just on the other side of the door. I was scared, more scared than I had ever been in my life, and I stood there paralyzed and convinced that I should just leave it alone. If I hadn't heard that vacuum again, I don't think I ever would have opened that door. The first thing I saw was Daniel, down on one knee, wrapped in a plastic poncho and with a dust mask over his face. He looked up at me in shock, and I couldn't help but notice the contrast between how sterile and perfect his outfit was, and how gaunt and pale and inhuman he looked, like some broken thing of a boy. Both he and the bathroom were covered in plastic sheets, stained with red splatter that touched the ceiling and pooled on the floor. Then I saw my wife, or what was left of her, slumped in the corner of the shower. Parts of her were missing, I could make out jagged and uneven cuts in her arms and legs, and even her breasts, which were nothing compared to the sucking wound on her neck where her head used to be. It makes me sick even thinking about it. She didn't even look like a human being anymore, but like some mangled doll chewed up by a dog. The shower was running over her naked, desecrated body, washing her blood down the tub's drain. I swear I could hear it gargle and moan as it struggled to wash down. The sickest part of all wasn't my wife's humiliated, tarnished corpse. It wasn't my son, covered in his mother's blood like some sick parallel to his birth. It's what he was doing with the parts of her that were missing. I glanced down, and to my horror saw my wife's arm, foot, and head all tightly wrapped in vacuum-sealed bags. Daniel had the vacuum tube in his hand, and had just finished cling-wrapping his mother's breast in another bag of its own. Every time I close my eyes, I still see her face, tightly wrapped in plastic like it was a second skin. Her mouth and eyes were open, suction molded around the thin barrier of her airtight coffin like she was screaming for release. "Dad," Daniel whimpered, a begging tone in his voice like he needed, desperately, to be understood. He sounded again like a child who had been caught doing something they knew they were in trouble for. And before he could even say anything, I was shaking my head, clenching my eyes shut against the tears that poured through. I made her clean. I made her perfect. It's been 2 weeks, and Daniel has since been arrested. A murder investigation is still underway, but they say they're at least going to charge him with desecration of a corpse. I've been staying in a hotel since the incident. They tell me the house is most likely going to be condemned, but I don't care. I can't ever step another foot into that place. I've felt physically better, less sick since I left, but mentally it feels like something's changed, and it won't ever be better. Through it all, I blame myself. I truly hate Daniel for everything he's done to us, ever since he was a boy, but I can't help but feel like it was my fault that he became what he was. I saw that obsession and paranoia form, all thanks to my meddling with his development. I saw the moment in his eyes when he stopped being my son and became whatever he was. I don't know what I'll do from here. My wife is dead, and the thing that used to be my son is probably going to prison. I wanted to be the perfect father, but I accidentally flipped that switch and turned my little boy into a monster. I'm making this post partially because I needed to get this off my chest, but also to warn all the parents out there to be careful how and what they teach their children. You might have a Daniel of your own, and who knows what'll flip that switch. Thank you for venturing into the darkness with us. If you dare to explore further, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more spine-tingling tales of horror and the supernatural. Remember, the shadows hold endless mysteries, waiting to be unveiled. Stay tuned for more bone-chilling stories as we continue to traverse the eerie depths of the unknown together. Until next time, may your dreams be free from the haunting echoes of our tales. Or perhaps not.